Hello, my name is Bret. This is my channel, and every week I'm here talking Docker, DevOps, Kubernetes, cloud native, all the things DevOps basically. If you're part sysadmin, a part operator, this is where you want to be every week on Thursday. And this week I'm traveling. You can see that my background is different. I'm actually in Missouri in the US. So I'm here focused on your course questions today. So we have these now once a month where I have no guests, I have no agenda. I'm not here to show you my latest projects or whatever I'm working on. I'm just here to talk to you, answer your questions, see what's up. We can talk about what's next in the courses, which is, stuff I've been talking about for a while, so that's not new, but we can always talk about that in case you haven't heard. I do have some news up front before we get to questions, so make sure you throw a bunch of stuff in the question list, and I will get to them in order as we go. All right, so thank you to all of you that are patrons and supporting this live stream, as well as the podcast that we're almost ready to get back to as we catch up with some of the work this year. So if you're not aware, patreon.com, you can go there under /Bret Fisher, and you can support this show by buying me a coffee every month. By the way, you don't have to buy the coffee to get some of the benefits. You can simply click the follow button there, and that will let you see all of my notifications for when I have live shows, when I have new content, when I have major updates to my courses or any of my open source, all that stuff. So it's about one, maybe two a week notifications or emails. So it's a very low amount of spam, and you can check that out. Also, you should definitely join the DevOps, what I'm calling the Vital DevOps Discord server. So if you've been members of the Slack community before, and maybe you've heard about Discord, you haven't checked it out yet, go check it out at devops.fan. That's up here right above me. devops.fan. That'll get you to our server. And we've got over 4,000 people in there now talking every day about various DevOps and container topics. And I like it. I think it's a lot more fun than Slack. It's a little less businessy so that we can all, have a little less work in our lives. So go check that out. I encourage you to join that for free. If you're in the courses, you can join the course help down there, and you can also ask your questions to the community there in the courses. Some other news that I want to get out of the way real quick is just a couple of reminders, right? We've got multiple things going on in May, so I want to make sure that you're up on that. We've got DockerCon. Actually, let's do these in order. Okay, first up, this week, if you're at all involved with the Docker 8th birthday, the birthday challenges, which I've been talking about for a couple of months since they announced it, a month or so. So tomorrow is the day they're going to give away the prizes. So if you were checking this out, basically, you go down here and you look at the list of leaderboard, and if you think you can approach the top, I don't know if it's the top 3 that they're giving prizes to. The top 3 individuals. So check that out, and you're competing with the Docker captains and the community leaders, so it might take you a little bit of work, but check that out if you're interested in some swag that will be mailed to you. I'm not sure what the prizes are, but Docker is doing that. That's at docker.com/birthday. Let me throw that in the chat. Next up, we got DockerCon. Actually, no, that's not next up. Next up is KubeCon. So next week, we have KubeCon EU. And if you're interested at all at that is not, I do not believe that there is a free version of that. I think you can watch the keynotes for free. And if you want to get into all the sessions and be a part of the chat, granted, most of the chat is for free because, as far as I know, they're not changing the way the event works. So with KubeCon and Cloud Native Con, you're basically in Slack, in the CNCF Slack. So you can sign up for that today. I think you just might need to Google CNCF Slack. And you can be in the channels and watch the keynotes. And if you don't want to pay, you can just wait for the YouTube videos to come out in like a month. They usually take about a month to show up on YouTube. All right, next up, DockerCon. And I'm not sure if I've talked about this, but I am going to be hosting some live panels, I think 3 at this point, throughout the day at DockerCon. DockerCon is a free event, end of May. So it's not just about Docker. There will be a lot of Docker-focused content, but there will be plenty of Kubernetes content, just talking about containers in general, all sorts of stuff. There's Docker 101 sessions and sort of workshop stuff. So if you're new to Docker, that's definitely something you want to check out. If you are more of a black belt and seasoned, there are going to be those sessions. I'm going to be hosting panels on everything from GitOps to like the latest and greatest in continuous integration and continuous deployment, and talking about running containers on servers without having to manage servers, what I'm calling sysadmin-less approaches to containers, not serverless, which is more like functions as a service and all that stuff. I'm talking more about running containers without having to manage servers and having to shell into anything. So we'll be talking about all that stuff throughout the day. Go sign up there free, dockercon.com. So I will put that up there. And then the last little thing I stumbled onto, I'm not sure where I found this. I think I found it from one of my newsletters. But of course, you've all probably stumbled onto some DigitalOcean community posts that are detailed walkthroughs of how to do something on Ubuntu or how to deploy so-and-so website, right, on Linux. But I thought this one was a really good reminder. And even though I've been doing IP-based protocol stuff for 25 years, it's always a good reminder. And I definitely had a nice refresher in this great article from Jamon. And it's a long one. So I'm going to put this in chat, and I recommend that you review it. Find some time, take 15 minutes. It's got some commands, and it's going to take you through some more in-depth stuff like SOCAT and other tools at the command line that are a good reminder about TCP, UDP, other IP protocols, because I still tell people when they talk about, if I want to get into DevOps, what are the things I should learn, all that. My first answer is always going to be more networking, because as we get more into cloud native, there's going to be more distributed computing. You're going to have more things on different servers, and a lot of your troubleshooting skills are going to be based on understanding what's coming in and out of your server, usually on IP-based protocols like TCP and UDP. And that requires a really firm understanding of IP packets, routing, subnets, IP protocols, how to listen on ports, how to inspect ports and see traffic, how to look at HTTP packets over the wire in real time. There's all that kind of stuff. And this is a really great article. It's even, I would say, for new people that are wanting to just dive in headfirst into networking. It's maybe not for someone that's brand new to computer networking, but if you're not really in depth with the different protocols and the ways to see them in Linux, because we have tons of tools in Linux for understanding networking, this will give you a nice introduction to some of them. And I definitely learned a few things. Netcat's in there. I don't think I've ever used StreamSocket, so that was a neat one for me, the SS command. But we have Netcat. We're able to sort of watch things coming in the wire. And when we in the real world, when I did workshops, we had a couple of in-depth workshops where we would go to the shell and we would actually watch packets coming in over Docker networks and Kubernetes networks to see how the traffic was flowing. But this is a really good one. I mean, they even talk about file sockets, datagram sockets, things on the local computer that don't actually use your networking interface over the wire. But that's all good stuff too. All right. I think that's it for the news. Hello, everyone. Let's scroll through some questions here. By the way, thanks, Kevin, for signing up as a patron. I totally appreciate it. Hello, Owen. I'm just going to put y'all on screen. All right, first question up, which I'm not going to have a great answer to. How do you set up a Redis cluster with Docker containers? So, there is the default Redis, Docker run Redis, right? That's a standard official image from the Redis team that is at Docker Hub. You can just start that up. Now, a Redis cluster is usually just 2 nodes and you have a mirror. So it's very little configuration change. You'll basically change the Redis config file, and you'll set up a replication there where the second one will receive, I can't remember if it's a push or pull. I think it pulls. pulls updates. Let's just say that it pulls updates. And it's a relatively simple setup. I think it's actually way simpler than traditional database cluster connections and all that stuff. It gets a little tricky when you want to do automatic failover. But I would say if you're new to Redis, start simple. Set up the two node cluster manually with Redis. And then you're going to need to go to the next level where you need automatic failover, which means you're going to have something in front of those Redis machines that will detect which one is available and fail over. It's a whole thing with Redis. And that's why if you're in the cloud, I always prefer to use the cloud provided Redis or really any other database technology. Because if you start talking about backups and monitoring and failover and all the things you have to care about with databases, it's a lot of work. And Docker doesn't make all that super easy. It's running your apps in an easier way, but it's not going to automatically set up a cluster for you. Now, once you graduate to Kubernetes and you get more into Kubernetes, I would check out Kubernetes Helm charts. Start Googling around to see if you can find a Redis Helm chart. I'm sure there's a good one out there. And that will help you deploy a Redis single node or multi-node cluster. Then after that, you can look at a Redis operator. I don't know any off the top of my head, but if you go to, let's see, this is maybe the most advanced. I would not recommend you start with this because you won't know how any of it really works under the hood and you'll be a little bit confused by the magic. And most of this isn't magic, right? This is configuration and automation just happening in the background. But if you go to Operator Hub, you can look for Redis. And operators are going to be more advanced typically than your Helm chart. And they're going to do things like allow you to do sort of one-line automated rolling upgrades, or maybe sometimes they might provide some sort of backup methodology or adding a new administrator user or something like that. Every operator is different. But you can see here we've got Redis Enterprise and other Redis options there. And you can check those out, see which one meets your needs. And that's probably the most production-y type thing that you'll want to do. But you always want to start with the basics. You want to understand how you configure Redis from the very beginning. And you do that by creating manual Docker containers, maybe creating your own compose file and then doing it that way. And it's going to be tricky and things won't work right away. But that's the best way to learn. I think the best way to learn is to try things, fail, fix them, maybe read a couple of Stack Overflow posts, figure out what you did wrong, go back to it. People that run right away to something like a Helm chart or an Operator Hub kind of configuration, they don't really understand all of how it's working underneath. So then when it doesn't work or it breaks, they don't have any idea how to troubleshoot it because they didn't really know how it worked in the first place. So I recommend you start with Docker. That was a great question. Thank you. Arun Kumar, I'm going to hopefully not butcher your name. Thanks for that. Does Kubernetes respect the Dockerfile user line? So 00 is this 00p5y? Let's see. OP? That's a great question. So what we're talking about here is a Dockerfile and a Kubernetes running the container that the Dockerfile produces. This brings up a great point. A Dockerfile is there's two parts of the world of containers. There's build time and there's runtime. Okay, build time is when you're using a Dockerfile. A Dockerfile creates the image that your containers start from. But don't confuse the Dockerfile and what it's doing at build time, like the user statements, the run statements. All those things are happening during the build. That's the image. Okay, so the image is now baked. We've got a solid image. Maybe we put it on Docker Hub. Maybe we put it somewhere else in the registry. So the user and the run commands have already happened. They're not going to run again. They don't matter anymore, essentially. The Docker file isn't even kept with the image. When the image ships, there is a history command that you can see the history of commands run, but that's not technically the same as the Docker file. So the Docker file is no longer relevant, really. And now you have this image. So when you spin up containers, if you're using a container runtime, which at this point, they all work the same way, whether you're using Docker or Containerd or Kubernetes with Containerd or Kubernetes with Docker, because if you remember from past shows, Kubernetes is not a container runtime. It just controls a container runtime like Docker or Containerd or CRI-O. And those things follow the specification for how to run an image in a container. So the long answer to your question is yes, it absolutely respects everything that you do during build time in the image, because that's the standard we have. All container runtimes, regardless of where you're running them, run a container from the same image standard and use the same image standard ways. Now, there are technically, if we get kind of nerdy for a second, there are technically two image standards. One of those is the OCI, which they all support. And then there's another one that's Docker. And what Docker does is they extend it a little bit. They add a little bit extra that may or may not work, but you're not going to really run into that in most cases. A good example of that might be the health check command. If you ever put a health check command in a Docker file, to my knowledge, only Docker, the container runtime Docker, respects that. For example, if you put a health check in a Docker file, Kubernetes won't use that health check. It will ignore it because it's following the OCI spec, which, again, they all work with. And 99%, 98% of all the commands in Docker will be a part of that OCI spec. So I would say that don't worry about it. Just build your images the way, and if they run the same in Docker, they're going to run the same in Kubernetes almost always. And yeah, I'm trying to think what else besides health checks. There are new things with something we call BuildKit that are experimental features, but that's more for a different question. That's a great question, though. Kevin asks, what is your best recommendation for transitioning from Docker Compose to Kubernetes YAML? Well, there's multiple parts of that question. Really, there is, have you learned Kubernetes YAML? Because you can't, if you're going to be using Kubernetes, you can't avoid learning manifests. You're going to have to learn the API and the manifests. And I talk about that in my Kubernetes mastery course. I actually take you through step by step of creating your own manifest from scratch, not using some blog, but using the API and the describe command. So from kube control, you can use the describe command, which is a great way to figure out what API stuff you need in the YAML. And you can also use other things like the create command, the kube control create command, and then you can do a git and actually pump that out as YAML. We do a lot of that in the Kubernetes mastery course, but that's learning the compose manifest standard. Then if you want to convert your YAML, which is kind of just a one-time thing, you can use something called compose. Compose with a K. So that is a standard that basically takes the Docker compose file and turns it into Kubernetes YAML. And that's, if you have a large, complex part, a lot of compose, if you have hundreds of lines of compose or more, then this compose tool might be great for you to convert. If you don't have that complex of a compose file, I wouldn't even really bother with learning the compose tool. I would just start from scratch and learn, through a course or something, learn the difference between Kubernetes services and Kubernetes deployments and Kubernetes stateful sets and, Kubernetes endpoints, Kubernetes pods. Like, these are the resource objects that you're going to have to learn in Kubernetes anyway. So when I create my manifest YAML, I always prefer to separate them out. So each YAML file in Kubernetes is a different resource object. So that way I have a list. If I have ingress, the typical website would have a deployment, have a service, and probably an ingress at least, and then probably some secrets and maybe some volumes. So those are all going to be different files. And that's a little bit different than Compose, where you had a single file. So anyway, I tend to go from scratch because I learn better that way. But if you have a ton of Compose to convert over, just try this Compose tool. Great question. Any recommendations for scheduling tasks batch in Docker or Swarm? So thanks, Wilton. That's a great question. So in Swarm 2021, if you are on the latest version of Docker, that's Docker 20.10.5, I think. If you're in the 20.10 version of Docker, then you have the jobs feature. So you can now schedule jobs. Well, you can't schedule. Sorry, let me back up. You can do jobs from the command line built into Swarm. That's a new feature as of last November, December. If you want to schedule them, then you're going to need something on top of that that does cron, a cron-like service. So I would recommend Crazy Max, as I've recommended before. So I would check this one out from one of the other Docker captains, Crazy Max. And yeah, go check that one out. And basically this is an add-on that you would run in a container in Swarm. It would provide the functionality you're looking for. Great question. Hello, Bron. As a DevOps engineer, should I learn JavaScript? I don't think it's a requirement. When I talk about it on this show, and I have a link of things that you might want to learn in which order. So that's bret.show/DevOps. I'll put that link in chat as well. Oops. I hit the wrong button. All right, so bret.show/DevOps will get you to a list. And I would not put JavaScript on the top of that list. I think that in everyone in tech, whether you're a developer, a sysadmin, a DevOps person, I think you need to know the web, meaning that you need to know HTTP, the protocol, and then you need to know the basics and how to write a basic web page in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So technically, I think that everyone in tech, even if you don't have a programming job, should understand how to make a website, at least the most basic one, from scratch. The basics of JavaScript. Take a one-day course where you've basically, you've made a digital counter on a page, or you've made an image swap on a page, or something very, very simple. You can get great courses. There's a fantastic course on Udemy from one of my friends, Colt Steele, Web Developer Bootcamp. It's one of the best courses out there, I think. And when it's on sale, bring this up. He just refreshed it. It looks fantastic. And unfortunately, I don't have a coupon. But if you wait for coupons or look around for them, this is a great Web Developer Bootcamp. So I think in tech, when you have the time and you have a couple of days, just dive into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because that will pay you back your entire career. There is not a week that goes by that I'm not working with some level of JavaScript, HTML, or CSS, regardless of what job I have. Here's a great example. Last week, I was helping a team make a Docker image of their Rails, their Ruby Rails app, right? And in order to test it, make sure it worked, I needed to run it on my local machine. So I created the Docker file, I got it built successfully. Now I need to run it. So I'm creating a little Docker Compose file. So that's my standard DevOps workflow. But then I need to make sure it runs correctly. So I do a Docker Compose up, the application comes up, and I try to bring it up in my browser. But then certain parts of the page don't load. So I think, I've got something wrong with the way that I'm building it. Maybe some file paths, or maybe some volumes I screwed up. And so that makes me have to go and right-click on the page and go down to inspect. And then I figure out which URLs are failing in the console. And I see the URLs, and I realize that there's a directory that I didn't actually build the static assets for, and the developer forgot to give me the line to put in my Docker file. Okay, that's a real world example, but I had to understand some basics about how a website works, and that means JavaScript, CSS, HTML, the HTTP protocol. What are HTTP status codes? What do those mean? What's the difference between a 300 and a 400 and a 500? So that's to me all about web development, and I've been using those skills since the 90s. That's how old I am. I was building websites from scratch in Notepad. And so I recommend that you just take some time. However, let's just back up a second. And I don't think that that is a required skill to be hired as a DevOps person. I don't think you need to know JavaScript so well that you can write it from memory. I do think that as a developer, you probably learn a language, maybe two. As a DevOps person, you don't have to learn deep programming knowledge. I think you can get very far in your career without fully knowing how to write JavaScript from scratch or Python from scratch. I do think you need to be able to read them. There's a big difference. Being able to understand their package format, how are packages installed in Rails, in Java, in .NET, in Node, right? These are all things in DevOps that you typically have to worry about. How are packages installed? What commands do I normally use to start the apps that my developers are giving me? And when it doesn't start up correctly, where's my config files? Where do I find my environment variables, right? So that configuration and startup stuff is really the realm of DevOps. And that means that you kind of need to learn a little bit about all the languages your team is using. So hopefully that helps you. I think if there was one language that most people would say you need to learn, it's Python. But here's the thing. I can't write Python from scratch. I can't sit down and write a working Python app without doing some Googling, right? I can read Python. I understand requirements and pip files and know how to start Python apps. And I know the common web servers because I've done enough of them. But I don't write them every day or every week even. So I would say that when you're getting started in DevOps and even throughout your career, you're going to be dealing with a lot of programming languages, and you might find one you like. I tend to spend more of my time in Bash and Bash scripts than I do in any single programming language, just because being a part of being a sysadmin is just kind of dealing with Linux, and the way you automate a lot of things in Linux is typically a shell if you can. And then as it gets more complex, you go to a programming language. But you can't escape Bash. Like it's everywhere. Shell scripts in general. So if there was one thing I would say at your very first job, learn first, I would say learning the shell and then learning shell scripting. Like that doesn't mean you have to be the best, smartest person at it, but learning it, understanding the basics of it, how to read it, finding some scripts on the internet, understanding every line of it and how they work, building a couple of basic ones yourself. I think that's absolutely necessary for any DevOps job. Okay. Great questions coming in. Thanks, everybody. Hello. Hello, Kumar. Hello, Raymond. Kubernetes and Docker Swarm both are the same. Can we do all the same things in both? Absolutely not. That's a great question. You basically think of Swarm as the easy button that has maybe 10% of the features of Kubernetes, maybe 20% of the features. It's the most important 20%. But most people leave Swarm for Kubernetes once they need more features than Swarm can give them. For example, you want to store database volumes on shared storage so that when your nodes fail over, it automatically connects your database to the storage over the network. Swarm doesn't have that built in out of the box. And most of the things out there that do that are either kind of complicated to get started with, they may not be well supported, or they're depreciated or deprecated. They're no longer around, like RexRay, which was my favorite. So typically, when you start to do more advanced things in Swarm, as you get better, you will eventually learn Kubernetes and have to move to Kubernetes. Doesn't mean Swarm doesn't do the job. I mean, my website still runs on Swarm right now. I still have multiple things running in Swarms just for personal projects because it's so easy and it comes built in. So why not? But as the world gets better at deploying Kubernetes, and what I mean is all the clouds now provide you Kubernetes. They now automatically set it up for you. They'll even auto upgrade it for you. They'll even manage your nodes so you never have to do SSH into your nodes to do patching or replace your nodes or whatever. So as the cloud gets better at that with Kubernetes, there's going to be less and less reasons why you want to start with Swarm. Even though I still teach it, it's sort of a starter. It gets you started, lets you know that it's there. There are still people at building features. Like there's a CSI feature that hopefully is coming this year. We don't really know, but hopefully we're going to get better storage support in Swarm this year. No promises, but there's still things happening in Swarm, but it's been completely dwarfed by the ecosystem of Kubernetes. Doesn't mean you can't use it. Just most of my, all of my business customers have moved on from Swarm and they're now using Kubernetes because there's just so much better tooling in Kubernetes now than it was 3 years ago. So it's easier for them to maintain. They can use Fargate on AWS. They can use Autopilot on Google. And these things all just run the servers for you. You don't even have to worry about, patching or replacing servers. You can just click buttons essentially and deploy your Kubernetes. So people have kind of moved on, but that doesn't mean Swarm isn't a good tool. Yeah, with Redis cluster, you need to use the host networking mode of Docker. Yeah, Paul's making a good point. If you are going to use Redis in production, granted, I use Redis every day in a regular Docker network, but it may not have the best performance. Basically, Google around, because there are some known issues with certain database technologies, and Redis isn't the only one, where using the virtual networking inside of Docker may not give you the best that Redis can give you. So definitely check that out. That's a great reminder, Paul. Thank you. I wonder if there's an operator equivalent for Swarm. Well, what I can tell you, Chris, is that recently, and I've been talking about this on the show, recently there's Swarm Sync. So let me show you this real quick. So I don't know this team, but it's a couple of people that have created the Swarm pack, and they have GitOps for Swarm, which I haven't tested yet. But these actually have been around a while. They're not really that new. But check out the Swarm Sync, because it's basically what we've been asking for a while in Swarm is how can I do automated deployments based on my Git repo, right? So go check out Swarm Sync. Raymond asks, what is the difference between DevOps and build automation? I would say that DevOps, build and automation are one component of DevOps. So one of the primary goals of a DevOps team is to automate as much as possible, reduce what we call toil or things that are repetitive. And so you want your CI and then eventually your CD, your continuous deployments, you want that whole pipeline to be as automated and as standardized as possible. And you want it to be very consistent. And the goal is that the developer commits code to a repo, it's auto-tested, it's built into an image. If that build and the testing succeed, then it automatically pushes it up to an image registry. And then optionally, it will automatically deploy it based on GitOps principles, which are changing YAML inside of a Git repo. And so that way you're changing things on servers in production, but you're logging the changes inside of Git. You know every change that happens in production because it's going through the Git workflow. So that is, you can say that that's just build automation. But DevOps is far more than that. DevOps is about people, is about process, it's about metrics. So it's about understanding business goals and going through the whole pipeline of development, shipping a feature, getting feedback on that feature, and then improving. And it's a continuous cycle. That's why there's that infinity loop, right? The infinity loop is the continuous shipping of code in an automated fashion as much as possible, learning and testing from the users of that code. So getting feedback and data so that you can make better decisions about the next updates and the next features, and that you're not just working in the blind. So it's very much about people and process as it is about tools, which is why if I were to ever do the DevOps course, which may happen, may not, we keep having to start and stop that build of that course. But if I was to make that course, it's going to be focused more on the people and the process. Tools come later. There's many, many tools out there. There's tons of tools. But the tools can be used any way you want. There is no DevOps tool. There are just tools, and you can use them to achieve DevOps goals, or you can use a traditional method before DevOps. Maybe we call it waterfall ops, where you just let things happen, and when they break, you have to figure out how to fix them instead of being proactive and doing better monitoring and doing better testing. Hello there. Hello, Andrew. All right, Gur asks, any tips for running a swarm with AMD 64 and ARM v7 v8 nodes? Probably needs adaptation of compose files. No, you don't need adaptation. If you know how to build Docker images using the new Docker buildx command, that's much easier for building cross-platform. And you can basically write the command docker buildx build -- platform, and you can specify all the platforms you want to build your image on. And then you can push those to Docker Hub or to your image registry. And Swarm knows if this node is an ARM node and it's running ARM v7, it knows to try to pull a v7 ARM image. And assuming that you've built that image and pushed it into Hub, it will automatically pull that. So for each repo in Docker Hub, for each image name, you can have different builds of the image. And that's using something called a manifest file, which you may not have even looked at. But there's a manifest file behind every single Docker image. So when you're pulling an image from Docker Hub, in the background, you may not have realized it, but your local machine or wherever you're running Docker will default to pulling the image that matches its own platform. So if you were to go take a look at something like Python on Docker Hub, you will see that there's tags down here, and it's showing things like ARM64, x86 64, PowerPC, ARM. Now the ARM tag just means v7 32-bit ARM. There's 386. There's mainframe stuff here. There's all sorts of stuff, right? And so that means that there's all those images there. And if I go look at tags, and I go look at this tag, see here, this single image repo technically has multiple images in it, one for each of these architectures. So that means if I'm on an ARM 64-bit machine, like an Apple ARM machine, Apple M1, I can just do docker pull Python : the tag name, so : slimbuster, and it will pull the ARM 64 automatically. Because it's an ARM 64 itself, ARM 64-bit V8 machine, it's compatible with that instruction set. So Docker knows that, and Docker will try to find that image. You will sometimes get an error that says can't find the image for your platform listed in the manifest, something like that. And that's basically saying, hey, I'm on an ARM 64 machine, and I just tried to pull an image that doesn't have an ARM version. For example, if we go to the MySQL image, the MySQL image, last I checked, only has AMD 64. So it only has Intel and AMD x86 compatible 64-bit architecture. So if you tried to get on an Apple M1 and do a Docker pull of MySQL, it will give you an error. Now, you can get around that, which we have tons of shows all year long that we've been talking about this. But if you do a Docker pull, you can do platform, and you can specify exactly the image you want to pull. In Docker Desktop will use something called QEMU to emulate other platforms. It's a platform emulator for Linux. So I can go in here and say Linux ARM 64 and do that, and it will pull that specific image. And then if I did a Docker run, I could specify that, and it would run that specific image through emulation. But in a swarm, to answer your question, a swarm automatically knows which node is running which architecture, and it won't try to get certain nodes running different architectures. It'll automatically figure that out for you. Your job is to just make sure you can build your images across platform, which is a whole separate conversation. Just basically go to bret.live, look back in the YouTube shows of this channel, and you will see where we talk about building images. There's a whole bunch of ARM stuff in there. So, How much beneficial is writing infrastructure as code to a DevOps engineer? It is vital. You must know how to do that. You need to know YAML really well because everything nowadays is in YAML. There's still some JSON, there's still some TOML, but YAML is the number one. So learn that first. And then learn things like Terraform. That's probably the first tool outside of containers that you want to learn is Terraform, because there's Terraform everywhere. Most organizations have a little bit of Terraform if they're doing automated deployments. So absolutely do that. I've not left Bash for Posh. I still do. I never left Bash, but I do. I have done some Posh. Thanks, John. Do you think a Raspberry Pi is a great way to learn to do clustered Docker? Sure. I think that it teaches you multiple things at the same time. It teaches you multi-platform, and you can do a cluster. But you can. I think it might be easier for most people to just create multiple virtual machines that are on the same subnet and do it that way. If you have multiple Raspberry Pis, then great. You can, if you wanted to learn multi-platform, one of the things I do is I have a Graviton machine that you can get from Amazon, because AWS now has the the ARM, the ARM Graviton 2s, and you can get one of those for like $8 a month. So I tend to have one of those just sitting there running, and I use it whenever I need to test something that's multi-platform. By the way, if you're in my courses, that's what we're working on right now, is we're going through all the stuff in the course and making the images work on Apple M1, which is ARM, and then also working on Raspberry Pis for these version 3s and 4s of Raspberry Pis, so that all the images and all the commands work the same way everywhere. It's turning out to be a little more work than we originally anticipated. So we're finding that a lot of the dependencies aren't built for ARM. So we have to go back to those, build them from source, or ask those open source providers to provide an ARM v7 or v8 thing. And so that's taking a little bit of time. I am 40 years old, Victor says. Is it too late for me to learn Docker? No, I am older than that. And Docker is only 8 years old now. So, technically anyone in tech had to learn Docker in the last 8 years. So no, absolutely not. You are a young person, Victor. Don't let anyone tell you different. Oh, and then everyone else is piping up saying, I'm older than 40 and I'm learning. So yeah, absolutely. Yep. I mean, I have cool moments all the time where I meet people that are older than me, and they have crazy stories about old technology that, 70s technology, 80s technology that I never got into because I was too young. And it's always cool to hear those old stories, because I want to be like those people. I want to be going to the conferences in 20 years, learning new things. Even when I'm old, whatever that means anymore. The day you stop learning something, it's over. That's absolutely true, Mike. Forever learning. Can I run a security scan on running containers? Absolutely. You would just need to. So there's multiple ways to scan, and there's multiple things that you might scan. So you can scan an image at any time. You can use something like Trivy or Sneak. These are two common tools. There's actually one built into Docker where you can do a Docker scan if you're on Docker Desktop. So typically they scan images. So you could just scan the image that running container is from. If you want to run inside there, then you will either need to install one of these tools in the container, so that you would basically exec into the container and then install one of the tools, or you would need to copy the container tool in, or you can sometimes do a bind mount in temporarily, so that, or you can if you're advanced, you can mess around with namespaces and technically get into the container's namespace and scan that way. You're not usually scanning running processes, right? Usually these tools are scanning the files inside the container and looking at the package manifests for all the, apt, npm, gems, right? Yum, all those different package managers. It's looking at those and looking at what they say they've installed. It's not typically scanning every single file on the machine like a virus scanner might. So yes, you can totally do that. Look up Trivy, Trivy, or Snyk, Snyk. All right, what's some more questions here? Can I run a 7.7 Elasticsearch even with BuildX on M1? Well, that's a great question. Stefanos, you should be able to answer that question for me based on what we just talked about. So go find the image, see if you can tell what other platforms it's built for, and then try to do that Docker pull. Remember that Docker pull command we just showed a while ago? So try to do a Docker pull specifying the platform of ARM, for example, ARM64, which is the latest, and specify the image name there at the end. Instead of putting in Ubuntu, put in your path to whatever your image you want to run. And it will tell you whether or not it can find that image. Hope that helps. Sam says, I'm 114 on Saturday. Impressive. Very impressive, Sam. There is no single programming language for DevOps. So, Mohammed, we talked about this about 20 minutes ago. I'm not sure if you're just joining, but rewind once the show is over. If you can't see it all the way, watch it a little bit later when you can rewatch the whole thing. I'm not sure how YouTube works when you join halfway through, but I have a link. If you scroll up, there's a link to my DevOps recommendations. It's called bret.show/DevOps. I think that Bash, if you don't know anything about any scripting language, I would start with the shell. I would learn the shell, just basic shell commands, and start and take a shell course. It's totally worth your time. And that'll teach you some shell scripting. And you can't avoid shell scripting in the DevOps world, or anything that's even remotely close to sysadmin. You will find that anywhere you can find a bash shell or a fish shell or a ZSH shell or just a SH shell or shell, you can use the POSIX standard, which allows you to create a shell script that works on any of those. And that is, I think, vital before you start learning programming languages, because often every team will use something different. Some teams use Python. Some teams use Ruby. They actually do, some of their automation with Ruby. Some use JavaScript with Node.js. Some that are Golang teams, they use the Go language. They love Go. So they're going to build infrastructure tooling in Go. You'll actually, if you go to conferences nowadays, you will see lots of people talking about the sysadmin, language of Go. Even though it's a compiled language, the nice thing about it is it usually produces a statically compiled binary, which means your tooling as an admin is now a single file, no matter the complexity of the app, no matter how complex it is. You just move it around as a single file. It's super easy to use. You could technically create a container with that single file in it, and now you have your tooling in that container with just one file. So there's lots of people that once they learn Go, they think that's the language of the future for everything, because it's great for networking. It has great networking protocol support. It's very fast. It's easy to do in open source and with a team. And so that's why you see a lot of the tooling, for example, Docker, Kubernetes, Traffic, all these other tools out there that are in the container ecosystem, they're all made with Go. So a lot of people that are in the open source think that Go is the future, but I would argue that DevOps has been around for decades. We just haven't been calling it that. And the tooling is often depends on the team and whether they're more dev focused. If they're dev focused, they might use Python or Node.js or Ruby. If they're more ops focused, they're probably going to be using Python or Bash. I would say go after one, learn Bash, then learn maybe one other one, and just learn that one just a little bit. And then from then on, it's more about package managers. But rewind back 30 minutes, and there's a bunch of answers in there that I gave earlier. Is there an alternative to Azure Edge? I'm assuming that AWS has something, but I don't actually use any of those services, so I don't know. Maybe someone in chat can answer that question. I don't have a good answer. How can I learn Golang programming? Well, you can start at the Golang website. They have some very basic tutorials. when you go to the website in the documentation, they have an interactive compiler that you can use right on the screen there. And then I would recommend looking up courses on Udemy because that's where I'm at. I don't make any Golang courses, but I have bought several other Golang courses there. I think there's ones by, let's see, is it Tom or Todd? Oh, Stephen Greider has a Golang course. I'm looking over. So yeah, I just searched Udemy Golang. So if you go to the Go programming language on Udemy, I have bought Todd's multiple courses from Todd. I haven't bought Stephen's yet, but I know that Stephen makes great courses. So I would trust his courses. And yeah, go check that stuff out. There's tons of stuff there. When they go on sale, go check it out. There's also tons of free resources out there. So if you want to go free, tons of stuff on YouTube, I would do that. Sam, surprisingly, I don't get as many blockchain jokes or questions as I used to. Like, I appreciate you bringing it back, because the blockchain. I have not worked with anything in the real world with blockchain. I just don't. Like, I'm not. I have a good friend that his entire company is focused on blockchain, but I don't do anything with it. So I don't have any. I don't know whether you were joking or not, but I don't have any answers. What is Docker Edge? Edge is no more. I know that there's a few videos in my course that talk about it because they're a little outdated. But Edge is basically beta, and they don't really have Edge anymore. When you're in Docker, let's see if I can bring this up. When you're in Docker, in the settings, if you're on a current version, you will just now see experimental features. And yeah, down here. So you'll see that, and that's kind of the beta Edge features. Edge itself is really no more. We just, like, if you're talking about the Docker daemon, to my knowledge, we don't even have a test release. We just have the Docker release and then the dailies anymore. They've kind of gotten rid of the Edge to simplify things and make it easier for the developers there. All right. Well, I'm caught up in all the questions. Oh, wait. No, I didn't. Let's see. Which job runs in the CI/CD pipeline in a branch? No master. David, I'm not really sure what your question is. Can you ask it a different way? I'm a little confused by the question. Or maybe someone else can help me understand. Not sure what you're asking. Are you asking about a particular CI tool? Because every CI tool is going to handle branches and building of things differently. So one of my thoughts on WSL2, I think you should use it. WSL2 is great. Learn the command line and enable it for Docker for sure. I enable it for all of my WSL2. So I might have, a CentOS, an Ubuntu, a Debian. I might have all these things in there, and then I go into Docker settings and I enable it so that it works in all of them. Because technically what's happening in the background is it's not really installing Docker in each one of them. It's using namespaces to basically kind of inject, that's probably the wrong word, but inject Docker and the CLI into that shell that you're using for every one of those WSL2s. I think the best way you can get performance out of it is when you're doing code in WSL2. What you want to do is you want to clone your source code into the Linux file system, not into your Windows host. And then you can use Visual Studio Code, which I think is the best visual editor out there for anything DevOps or coding. You use that, and it has a remote feature that now VS Code is smart enough. It will say, hey, you got WSL2. Should I enable the extension for remote? And what it will do is it will connect into Docker and the containers inside of WSL2 and make it way easier for you to develop inside containers. It's pretty cool. I always use that when I'm on Windows. Fortunately, we don't have that same thing on Macs exactly the same way. So on Macs, if you want to set up multiple VMs and all that, my favorite is multipass, which I've talked about on this show before. If you're on a Linux machine or on a Mac machine, go check out multipass.run. That is essentially Ubuntu's way of quickly spinning up an Ubuntu server. It gives you the full server, and it takes about 30 seconds to spin up a new one, and you use a really easy command line to just create new VMs. It's way easier than VirtualBox. In the background, it actually can use VirtualBox or any other hypervisor that you want it to use. You can use LXD, you can use Xhive on Mac or Hyper-V on Windows. It will use whichever one is available, and it kind of has a list that it supports. But in the background, it's just downloading a standard Ubuntu image, which you can change. You can tell it to use other versions of Ubuntu and possibly even third-party ones if you want. And it's just a couple of command lines to get started. And it's really fast. I mean, in terms of getting started and spinning up a machine, you can't beat it. Now, if you have WSL2, use WSL2. It's probably better and faster. But upcoming guests on the show. So, all right, first up, I'm not going to be doing a live show next week. I don't know what our plans are for KubeCon next week, but I'm not going to do a standard live show like this. At least I don't think. Pay attention to my Patreon. Again, that's like a shameless plug over there. Go to Patreon, sign up, click the follow button, and you'll be getting my emails whenever we know what we're going to do for KubeCon, if anything, because I'm still traveling. But for after that, I'm not sure what we were doing in terms of guests, because I'll be preparing for DockerCon. So we've got a bunch of guests I'm going to have on the DockerCon show at the end of May. And right now, we're all focused on that. So I actually don't know if I have anyone scheduled for that. And yeah. Anyone ever tell me I look like the Rick and Morty creator? So I'm assuming you mean Dan, because there's two creators, two of them, and Dan is one of the main writers, and co-creator. No one has told me that, but thank you. I love that show, Rick and Morty. What would you say to someone who has been a DBA for many years and they're trying to get into DevOps world? I would say go back to the beginning of the show when we talked a lot about DevOps and what you need to know. I gave you some links, including bret.show/DevOps. That'll take you to a list of things. I think it's totally possible. I think if you're interested in DevOps, the first things you need to do are essentially to learn Linux and to learn the command line, because everything else builds on that. You know, learning a programming language, learning containers, learning, scripting, learning server networking and clouds, that all assumes you know how to get into a server and you know how to manage a server and network servers together, right? So if you're brand new to that, learn Linux, take a Linux course, absolutely take a networking course. I would say Linux and networking are equally important. And then you can start building on that. And you don't need to learn all the clouds. You don't need to learn all the languages or all the tools. You just learn one of everything. And that's what I talk about in that post. For example, if I go to bret.show/DevOps, you'll see a show, a question that one of the students asked, and I go through lots of answers. And it's just my opinion. Doesn't mean I have the only opinion or the correct opinion. So I talk through that. Other people comment. I add more details. It goes on and on. So go check that post out. There's lots of resources out there. But I think if you want a good place to get started, because it's about the mindset of what DevOps is, because DevOps is not a tool. And so I would say there's a couple of great courses out there that you should take on the mindset of DevOps. And while you're doing those mindset courses, learn Linux and learn server management. Any new Kubernetes courses coming out? No, the plans are right now is where we're fixing all the outdated stuff in the courses today, and then I'm going to be adding more sections to Kubernetes Mastery. So if you're in Kubernetes Mastery, expect those those as the next big release, and you'll see that if you're on our Patreon or if you're in the courses, you'll be getting the emails when that stuff is updated. Thanks, Zolt. Ooh, multipass doesn't work on M1 Max yet. Interesting. All right. Well, you're going to have to be doing your Docker run Ubuntu over there, I guess. That's unfortunate. I was kind of hoping they'd be fixed by now. There are a couple of things on my M1 that don't work. I think I got Docker. I think I got Docker works. Parallels now has released their VM solution. Trying to think else what didn't work. Google Docs didn't work, or Google Drive rather, but I think that might be fixed now. Google Drive was a pain. Thanks for the upvotes. In a feature branch, okay, so David's coming back. Maybe it's a little more detailed of a question. In a feature branch, do I suggest executing the entire pipeline that you would normally execute in master, except for deploy to prod, or do you prefer to execute only some of the steps in the pipeline? I think it depends on the pipeline, but I would opt in to everything you can. Everything from full testing, as much testing pipelines as you have, as well as building the image, because building an image and testing in that image is the way you should be doing it in containers. So I typically will build, we might do a couple of basic things first to make it easy. So I might do a security scan of the image that it's from first, because if there's a hard requirement for maybe no critical CVEs, and I know that I can't move forward if that's a problem, I might just scan that image first because it's easy and it's quick, because that only takes like a minute. So I would do that, and then I would build the image. And if the image is successful, then I would do all my testing in and with the image. So all my CI testing, all my, do the unit testing, and then the integration testing and the function testing and all that stuff. I would see the database, and I do all that in containers. And then if all of that finally works, I would ship the image. Now, what I like to do is for PRs, if we're talking about pull requests, when you're building in a different branch, depending on your team, I may not have anything happen in the branch until it becomes a PR. So once the PR process starts, at least for me and my personal work and some of the teams I work with, that's when we start doing the CI. So that way you can just be in a branch doing your own thing. You don't have to worry about failed CI testing. And then that to me creates an ability for you to not be scared to push code, because you're scared that someone's going to see a failed CI build. So that way you can push to the branch. And then when you want people to start paying attention, then you make a PR for it, have your CI then pick up the fact that it's a PR, and then for every commit, start doing all that testing and the image build. And in that case, what I usually will do is I will ship an image to my registry, but I'll have the PR number in it. Or maybe in some cases the PR name or the commit, but of the commit ID. But I like the PR number. And then maybe either a commit ID of Git, or maybe it's the job ID in your CI solution, or maybe it's a date timestamp or something like that. But that way I can then, while I'm testing, I can now pull down my PR images without having to build them locally. So I can get them from my registry. So I like doing that, but you might avoid that. And then, yes, of course, your final image, when it's merged into main or master or whatever your main branch is, that's when you would make the official, image that whatever your standard is, right? For making the official image, that's what I would do. Great question, David. Yeah, Kubernetes mastery. So that's not going to happen in May, because I've got the big conferences in May, and then we're doing a bunch of fixes. So expect those late. If you're in the northern hemisphere, it'll be summer. Expect that stuff later on this year, as we fix the stuff that's in there. VS Code for M1 works great. I was using on my M1 the Insider build, which is like their beta. So if you use the Insider build, it was working fabulous in February. I'm not sure. They may have fixed it in production. So I would say download regular VS Code, and if it's slow, because that was one of the problems, is it was actually pretty slow. Go get the insider build, which was not. But you can just Google it, because I think everyone right now that's getting an M1, there's a lot of people using VS Code. Yeah. Oh, look at that. Paul's already answered you. I don't even know why I'm here. Paul's got all the good answers there. David's back. Yes, very clear. After raising the PR, would you perform the pipeline in every push? Yes. Yeah, I would. I mean, because you never really know when the final commit of your PR is going to be. So if I only did partial stuff in the PR, I might have some other failure that I don't know about yet until I merge code into the main, right? I mean, and I don't want that to happen. So, and I want everything to be automated. I don't want anyone to have to go into a CI and click a button to run a part of the CI. Now, this really depends on your budget and how fast your CI is, so that is, there's no finishing there, right? That's always something that you're trying to improve, make it faster, make it more parallel. Yeah. Zolt's talking about making a namespace in K8s for the branch. So all the branches are built and run in K8s in different namespaces. That's a great, I have done that many times where teams maybe, and sometimes what we'll do is we'll only do it for epics. So if you're in that world where you're using an epic pattern for your teams, because not every PR needs its own separate build inside of a Kubernetes cluster, and maybe you empower your developers to run it locally. You give them some simple Helm charts or something, so they can run it on their local machine if they just want to see if it works. But what I tend to do is, if we're going to make that automated build where it will not just build but also deploy onto a Kubernetes, and you can use something like Route 53 in AWS to automatically create DNS names so that every single epic has its own URL for the website. I tend to only do that for epics, because when you do it for every PR, and of course, it totally depends on the size of your team and your budget. But when you do it for every PR, you end up with a lot of stuff. Now, one of the key pieces there is that once the PR is merged and you've shipped the code, you need to have something in there that automates the tearing down so that you're not left with a whole bunch of stuff that's still running. So typically when a PR is merged, I'll make sure that the CI process knows to go and kill that stuff in Kubernetes. But yeah, I like doing it per epic, because those tend to be longer, right? Because you'll have multiple PRs related to an epic or something. So if there's not an epic, maybe don't. But again, it's based on your team. All right. Any more questions before we wrap this up? I'll give you a minute to throw those questions in. I'll make a couple last minute reminders. So I talked about Patreon several times. If you want to get my updates or support this show, jump over there. If you go to the devops.fan link, you can join our Discord, where we're in there every day chit-chatting, talking about things. I learned it, just by the way, I learned about this neat. So there's all sorts of, Emacs, Vim, whether you're on which side of the fence you're on. I'm a Vim person, and NeoVim is sort of the latest fork or iteration of Vim standard in a more modern CLI client. And of course, there's tons of ways to run Vim in a GUI, but this Rust one looks pretty sweet. I do like the new graphics of it. So you can learn about that stuff in Discord. Just a little plug there for the Discord chat. I learned from the great team that we have in there. I'm so appreciative of, I learned so much through our Discord server. I learned about all the cool stuff. And usually if I learn about something on Twitter and I go into our Discord, someone's already posted it. So I'm usually behind the times on that. And then just a reminder, the Docker birthday event tomorrow, they're going to have the awards. So if you were in the running for that, make sure you jump back into the birthday. That's docker.com/birthday. Sign up for KubeCon, which is next week. And then DockerCon, which is free at the end of the month. Sign up for that, which I will be doing a bunch of live shows during that day. Thanks, Michael. And I appreciate everyone else. So I appreciate you all showing up for this live show. I will, We are probably not going to have a show next week, so don't count on it. If you want to know what's going to happen next week, if anything, around KubeCon, then join my Patreon, patreon.com/Bret Fisher. You'll get those notifications. Of course, I will always post things on Twitter, but sometimes it gets lost in the Twitter feed. So check that out. And thanks a lot for showing up. I will see you, if not sometime next week for KubeCon, I will see you the week after back here on YouTube Live, usually every Thursday at the same time. Thanks.